enormous vacancy that's there now, and we need to put people on the bench that understand that the Constitution is not a living and breathing document. It is to be interpreted as originally meant.
Quickly, though, on this question.
Welcome once again to the House of More Politics. And hey, I'm very, very pissed off. If you watched the beginning and you saw that video, how can you say that the U.S. Constitution is not a living, breathing document? I want to believe that it is. And I got some proof. See, I got my notes here. I got some proof, in my opinion, that would let me know that the Constitution is a living, breathing document. Okay, first, let's just start off by saying this. All right, the people had a fear of the central government in the beginning. All right, at first, America was ruled by King George III of England. So we were really skeptical when we became a nation of our own, an independent nation. We were skeptical of government. So we first started out, before we had the U.S. Constitution, we first started out with the Articles of Confederation. That was ratified or voted on March 1st of 1781. And we had, now mind you, the Revolutionary War was over around 1780, 1781. So we didn't get our first president until 1789. Now, before that, we had presidents of the conventions or presidents of the body of the House. We've had 8 or 9 of those before we had President George Washington. He's the first president under the U.S. Constitution. Okay, but we had 8 or 9 other presidents before George Washington. We just celebrate George Washington as the first president because he was indeed the first president, but under the U.S. Constitution, which is what we live under today. But at first, it was the Articles of Confederation, and that particular article or that particular document gave too much rights or too much independence to the particular states. And the government couldn't print money. We couldn't ratify treaties. There was a lot of things that the U.S. government could not do. And it made it difficult for the U.S. government to represent the country as a whole. So we went back and had another convention. And the guys got together and they figured, hey, let's just go ahead and scrap the Articles of Confederation because there's no way to really fix this thing. Let's scrap it and start over. So that's what they did. They had a convention in 1787, and it took them 2 years to get it together. And they did this under cover of darkness. Well, not cover of darkness, but they closed all the doors of the Philadelphia office. They kept it all in secret. Nobody put it in the press because they didn't want anybody to try to sway or convince or do anything to try to get these guys to change their minds or go one way or go another way. So they had kind of like a closed session. And they got together and they came up with, 2 years later, they came up with the U.S. Constitution. And that was, I'm sorry, let me go back. It was created, like I said, September 17th, 1787, but it was ratified. That means all the states approved it, or three-fifths of the states approved it. And at the time, we only had 13. So it took all 13 because mail was hard to travel. It didn't travel that fast back in the 1700s. So it took 2 years to get the thing ratified. And it was ratified in 1789. And that's when they said, hey, let's go ahead and elect our first president. Everybody was in agreement that George Washington should be the first president. And they went through the motions, but it was already kind of known that he was going to be the first president. So that's the way it went down. But as far as it being a living and breathing document, okay, here is my take on why I think it should be a living, breathing document, and why I think Marco Rubio and anybody that thinks that the Constitution is not a living, breathing document is dead wrong, in my opinion. All right. Article 1. Now, when they wrote this, don't get it twisted. Okay. The Constitution has only 6 articles. It's only been amended 20 something times, and I didn't look it up, but it's been a couple of times, over 25, 29 times that it's been amended. Okay. But it only has 6 articles in the beginning. The first article, it talks about Congress and the legislative branch. Okay, it talks about, it says in there that the Congress will consist of a House of Representatives and a Senate. And it breaks down what their responsibilities and what their roles are. The second amendment, the second article describes the president and his duties. The third article talks about the court system. So in the first 3 articles, you got the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. Okay. Now, the fourth article talks about relations of states and states with the federal government. So it explains how the states could work together and how the states, either individual or collectively, work with the federal government. Okay. And then the 5th article outlines process of amending the Constitution. See, they already knew that this was not perfect. So they needed to put something in there to say, okay, we may not get it all right now, but if ever somebody come with a good idea or something that's going to further make our liberties and our people free and independent, let's put something in here that's going to be able to expand or elaborate on what we're talking about in the rest of these articles. Article 6. It established the Constitution and federal laws and treaties to be the supreme law of the land. So the reason why we have a Supreme Court, and that's why they say the Supreme Court is the supreme law of the land, because the Supreme Court has the final say. So if all the lower courts are in disagreement on what should be done or how this should be ruled, or is this constitutional or what goes on, the Supreme Court, the judicial branch, makes that decision. And each state has to follow that decision. Now, the state can't make a law that's gonna supersede or bypass or ignore the Constitution and the Supreme Court. They can't do it, because the Supreme Court interprets what the Constitution is saying, and thereby obeying the Constitution. All right. Article 7. It processes. It is the process of ratifying a new government, and what that basically means is the 2/3 vote. I know earlier I said 3/5, but it's not 3/5. You need 2/3. So that's what Article 7 is. In order to amend the Constitution, you need a 2/3 vote. And that's the U.S. Constitution. That's it. But the founders knew off completing this that they were missing some things. I mean, this was basically an explanation of how the government was going to run and how the states would work in conjunction with the government. This is nothing to do with the rights of the people. So they went back and they changed it. And by doing so, we have the first 10 amendments, or what we know today as the Bill of Rights. So there are 10 right after they wrote the Constitution. So, inside the Constitution, a black person was 3/5 of a person when it came to representation in a certain state. Because the way the states work, the House of Representatives is proportioned by population. And the reason why they did this was because small states were afraid that the larger states will make and change and ratify laws to go along with the large states, and the small states to be left out. So the House of Representatives is proportioned by population. And the North was afraid that the South was going to rule and make laws and do everything because they had slaves and they would consider them citizens. And because of that, they would get more representation in Congress. So they said, okay, to compromise, which is what they called it, the 3/5 compromise, A slave would be 3/5 of a person when it came to representation, but they still considered the black man property. Thomas Jefferson himself had kids by a black slave known as Sally Heming, and he treated his kids from her no different. If you go back to his records, you would see that he would label ox, saddles, boots, and his slaves because they were property to him. Even his kids were property to him. So that's the way they considered it. So we, according to the Constitution, we're 3/5 of a person. It took the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to fix all that. But let's just talk about the First Amendment is freedom of religion, speech, and the press. And the reason why that is because the Puritans came over here for religious freedom. They were being persecuted over in London and England and all these other different places. So they came here for their religious freedoms. So yes, America is founded on Judeo-Christian values, but this country was set up for your religious freedom. And the reason why we have a freedom of speech is because you didn't have the freedom of speech in France, in Spain, in England, in Russia, and all these different places. Because if you spoke out against the government, or if you spoke out against a certain religion, or if you spoke out against a certain monarch or a king or a government, you were killed. You were tortured. So that's why that's there. And the freedom of the press is because it goes back to the freedom of speech. If the press talked ill about the government, the monarch, the king, the politician, they were killed. Their businesses was destroyed. So they made sure, hey, let's put that in there first. The Second Amendment is the right to bear arms. And the reason why the Second Amendment is the right to bear arms is because, again, when England came here to make sure that America stayed in line, we wanted to make sure that we could fight back. You want to fight back against the government, they be persecuting you. So our government said, hey, we want to keep the citizens with the right to bear arms, just in case the government gets out of hand, the people can do what we did back in 1787, 1786, and the early foundings of this country. We can go to war with the government, get it back in line, reset the government, and start over. That's why we have the right to bear arms. Amendment 3 was housing soldiers. Again, it goes back to King Edward. When he brought his soldiers here, they will quarter themselves in your home. So imagine the Marines coming to your house and saying, hey, I want that staff sergeant in that bedroom. I want the lance corporals in this bedroom. Me as the captain or the OIC, I'm going to stay in this bedroom. You wouldn't like that. But that's what happened back before the Revolutionary War. They came here, they ate their cattle, they ate their food, they grazed off their lands. They housed themselves in their house. So when we became a government of our own, we said, hey, we don't want soldiers just coming in and just making it their entity. Amendment 4, you have protection from illegal searches and seizures. When you watch all these cop shows, Law and Order and things like that, the first thing the criminals say is, you got a warrant? Can we come in and search the premises? Got a warrant? That's where that comes from. The government just can't come into your house unless they have just cause. Amendment 5, protection of rights to life, liberty, and property. You ever heard of pleading the fifth?
I plead the fifth.
Exactly. Okay, I'm going to speed this up a little bit more so I can go ahead and wrap this up. So Article 6 is the rights of the accused persons in criminal cases. Amendment 7 is rights in civil cases. Amendment 8 is excessive bails, fines, and punishments are forbidden. So you can't go and do 100 years for stealing a pack of gum out of Walmart. Amendment 9 is other rights kept by the people. So all the other things that they couldn't remember, they try to do a catch-all and say, hey, any other rights that we failed to remember, it's in this amendment. And Article 10 or Amendment 10 is undelegated powers kept by the states and the people. So there you have it. The first 10 amendments gave you things that the Constitution didn't give you. So if Rubio is saying that the Constitution should be interpreted the way it was originally written, where would this nation be today? And there are 27 amendments total. They did prohibition in the 1920s, only to rescind it in the 1930s. So what does that tell you? So this is why I consider the Constitution a living, breathing document. Yes, the job of the judiciary system is to interpret what the founding fathers meant when it comes to modern issues. The founding fathers had no idea that in 2016, a semi-automatic weapon can fire so many shots in so many seconds. As a matter of fact, George Washington himself thought that the country would last no more than 20 years tops. So there you have it. Now, there was a hope that the country would continue on for perpetuity, but we're still a work in progress. We're still a young country. So yes, I would consider the Constitution a living and breathing document. How about you? So give me some feedback. Let me know what's going on. See if you like the post. If not, let me know. If you do, give me some thumbs up. Send me some comments. And until then.